Thank you, Warren, and thank you, everybody. Before I begin, may I have a quick survey to know if anyone in the audience have had prior experience with art history talk, or have learned about life of the Buddha. So we see one person raising hand. Okay. So the purpose of this talk is very simple, is to use pictorial representations, which includes paintings and sculptures, to introduce the life of the Buddha. And the Buddha we're talking about is Shakyamuni Buddha, who was the founder of Buddhism. And before we start, I'd like to give you a background on where the stories of the Buddha came from, where they are hidden in Buddhist scriptures. The type of scriptures that's related to Buddha's life are two types. One is called Jataka tales and sometimes called Avandana tales. These are stories of Buddha's previous lives in which he performed meritorious deeds and leading up to his last birth as a person, as a prince. And the stories about that last birth, basically his biography, was called the Buddha Karita. And this part is what we are focusing on, is about the Buddha as a bodhisattva born into a kingdom in India and grew up, left home to meditate in the mountains, became a Buddha, and then share his teaching with people who wanted to learn about Buddhism. So on the right side of the screen, you see a lot of Chinese characters. These are basically the scriptures that is available to us in Chinese. And I would say 99% of them are translated from languages from Central Asia and India, except for the last one. I can't find the source. And this particular scripture, you can follow my cursor, is also not included in the standard Tripitaka. You can see the T, that means Tripitaka, and the number indicates its order in the Tripitaka. So the type of scriptures we consider today are from T184 to 196. These are the main texts that I rely on to build the PowerPoint presentation today. Now, there are very, very few non-Chinese texts. One is called Mahavatsu. That's in Sanskrit, not in Chinese translation. And the other is in Pali language. It's a Vinaya text, which is a precept text. And then the last one is Mahayana Mahaparamita. Mahaparinirvana Sutra. This is a text that covers a lot of details of Buddha's life, later part of his life. which is very different from all the Chinese versions that you see here, which didn't go very far into Buddha's late life. However, from the pictorial evidence we have today, we find that the text and the images correspond with each other very well. And that gives us a sense and confidence that the oral tradition in Buddhism is very reliable, because it passed on for several hundred years before they were actually recorded. And the way the pictorial evidence and the scriptural evidence match very well shows that the tradition passed on rather faithfully. Okay, so we'll begin our presentation today by first looking at the conception. That's the beginning of the pictorial tradition that documented Shakyamuni Buddha's birth. So in the Mahayana tradition, we all learned that the previous lives that we had dictates our current birth. And those who are enlightened can choose their destiny. And so in this case, we have is a very high-ranking bodhisattva who had decided to come to this world through a conception and decided to go to a small kingdom in India. So in the pictorial representation, that shows the bodhisattva in the form of an elephant, which is usually 6 tusks, but we don't see that in the pictorial representation. The elephant enters into the side of his mother, Queen Maya, and there are many representations of this. Here is another one. You can see the elephant hovering in the sky. It's about to enter into Queen Maya's side. Okay. Here's another one. We're not going to touch up on the artistic traditions today because it's too much to talk about. But these pictures are here to mainly represent events of the Buddha's life. So in this sculpture, you can see a moon-like disc. That's the representation of the Bodhisattva coming down for the conception. And then there's one depiction from China that shows the Bodhisattva is actually on the white elephant coming from heaven to enter into his mother's womb. So the story goes that after 9 months, the Buddha was born. And the birth of the Buddha was also very unusual. It was when his mother was walking in the garden, and when she reached to grab a tree, that the young prince emerged from the right side of his body. So you can see here, a Brahmin is receiving the newborn baby who already has a halo in this representation. And another example shows the Buddha coming out from the side of mother, also received by a Brahmin. And here is another one. This one is from Yungang, which is a cave temple complex in China in Shanxi province, from cave 6 of Yungang. Okay. So the text mentioned that it was on the 8th of April that the Buddha was born, and born from the right side of his mother. And miraculously, immediately after his birth, he took 7 steps and raised his right hand and said, I am the king under the heaven. The three realms are overburdened with suffering. Where is joy? So in pictorial representation, you oftentimes see the Buddha walking. In this very interesting case, each step is represented by a lotus flower. But this is only 5 flowers, but that's enough to illustrate the first 7 steps of the Buddha. Supposedly, the Buddha walks without touching the ground, and a lotus flower emerged to cushion him. So here, a Japanese 15th century representation shows that there are 7 lotus petals on the ground, indicating the first 7 steps of the Buddha. And he also raised his right hand and declared that he is the king under the heaven. And also at that moment, supposedly there were 9 dragons or 9 Naga kings appear in the sky and gave Buddha his first shower. So here it's represented by 2 dragons, 1 green and 1 red. And this water pouring down on the Buddha is a representation of the first bath of the Buddha, sometimes refers to as the first shower. So in this Chinese representation, which is now in the British Museum, you can count there are actually 9 dragon heads and the black clouds, and the rain comes down to shower the Buddha, who is standing in a golden basin. And then below this representation on the ground, on the bottom part of the picture, is actually the representation of the first 7 steps of the Buddha. Okay, so on the day that Buddha was born, it was very auspicious. Therefore, the dragons came to shower him. Here is another example from the Northern Zhou dynasty, which is about 550 to 570 CE. This one is from Dunhuang in Western China, Cave 209. And here's another example from Cave 6 from Yungang. There are total of 8 dragons. So the 9th dragon is recorded in the text, but in pictorial representations, oftentimes you see different numbers. Okay. And April 8th is remembered as the day of Buddha's birthday. And so on this day, we celebrate Buddha's birthday by performing bathing the Buddha ceremony. And this particular example is from 8th century Japan. So we can know that this tradition of bathing the Buddha on his birthday started in East Asia very early. Japan learned Buddhism from China. So we know that this tradition must have started in China much earlier. So on the day of Buddha's birth, there were other auspicious births. One was his horse. This baby horse, which was a white horse, has a name called Kantaka. And also there were goats have been born in the palace. And there was another person mentioned who was the groom of the horse, Chandaka. These two, the horse and the groom, will become important part of Buddha's life, as we shall see later in this presentation. So after the birth, after the 7 steps, and after the shower, they left the garden and returned to the palace. So this is basically a triumphant entry into the city wall, and Buddha was carried on an elephant, and in front of the elephant we have horses led by noblemen coming into the city. So returning to the palace is what this scene means. And in this Chinese representation, the Buddha is shown with a nimbus held by his mother on a white elephant. So the difference between this image without the Buddha and this image with the Buddha are two traditions in Buddhist art. In Buddhist art, there was one period when the Buddha himself was not represented. We call this kind of Buddhist art an iconic Buddhist art, which means that the Buddha was not represented in a human form, but it's oftentimes suggested by the presence of something associated with him. So later on, we're going to see examples of that. So once they arrived back in the palace, the Buddha's father, the king, invite a Brahmin, ASITA, ASITA, to read the Buddha's fortune, SIDDHARTHA's fortune, and notice that he had 32 auspicious signs, which make him either a great king or a war savior. And so his father understood that he had a very unusual child. So here is another example of the Brahmin ASITA holding up the baby with a nimbus, and the father and mother next to the Brahmin who is reading the Buddha's 32 marks. Okay, so the father knows that the Buddha is, the prince is very, very special. And so the father tried to do everything that he could to keep the prince in the palace and also make his life as comfortable as possible. So he built 3 palaces. One called the Autumn Palace for the rainy season. One's called the Cool Palace for the summer. One's called the Warm Palace for the cold winter days. Not only that, the Buddha also selected 500 beautiful women. They're all good looking, not too fat or not too thin, not too tall, not too short. Their skin not too pale or not too dark. And they are very skillful with multiple skills. And they're all adorned with jewelries. And the father also had hundreds of bodyguards around the palace. The palace is planted with fruit trees, bath pools, all kinds of birds. And so if you can imagine, it's almost like a Pure Land. But the father's doing so was to prevent his son from going into the mountains to become a person who seek the way. So he built very thick and tall palace walls, and he also made the door making squeaky sounds that can travel for 40 li, which somewhere around 40 miles. So he basically prevented the Buddha from leaving the palace. Okay, so in this pictorial representation, it's a very adequate picture of how the Buddha's life was in the palace. You can see men and women embracing. You can see people drinking. So it was a very indulgent lifestyle in the palace. In addition to that, the Buddha also received regular education. This image shows the Buddha going to school, riding on the chariot pulled by goats. And among his education, there are two kinds. One is the civil education. On the image here on the right, you see going to school on the right side, and then sitting in classrooms with classmates studying. And the other part of the education is this martial education. In the scripture, it was recorded that he was involved in wrestling that you see on the right. And then there was once his classmate Nanda pulled the elephant by its trunk into the garden or into the courtyard. And then another friend of his, Devadatta, was very powerful and strong and picked up the elephant was going to throw. But the prince smiled and walked and received the elephant and moved the elephant effortlessly outside the wall without hurting it. And therefore, the two friends knew that they could not compete with SIDDHARTHA. And the king and his officials also knew that this young child is very, very special. And they know that they couldn't keep him in the palace long. Okay, so another part of the Buddha's martial education included archery. That's what you see here on the right. Okay, so we don't know when Buddha began to meditate, but in the records we learned that the Buddha was kind of shocked by the predatory nature basic to survival that he must have observed in daily life in the palace. And so he began to ponder on the life and death and also began to meditate. Now, in record, first meditation was during a plowing festival. He went away to sit under a jambu tree to meditate. And his father, of course, was there, and his father saw him meditating and realized and recalled ASITA's prophecy. And the father bowed to his child. So in the picture here, you see the plowing ceremony, the festival, and there are two men sort of bowing to the meditating Buddha. It's hard to say which one is the king. Okay. So after a while, SIDDHARTHA was very bored in whatever he was able to enjoy in the palace, and so he asked his father to go out, and so he had 4 exits that's recorded in these Buddhist texts. But there was one text that mentioned that SIDDHARTHA actually saw a woman after the 4th exit. But but the 4 is probably the most popular number for the reason that there were 4 gates of the city. So he went out from each one of them that made up the 4. There's also some sayings about the 4 represents the 4 directions. But in any case, the number 4 is what we use today in all the pictorial representations. So here I have a picture from the British Museum showing the Buddha going out from the east gate of the city, and that's the gate that he went out and encountered an old person, and of course his father tried to prevent him from knowing the reality of life. So he had never seen an old person before. So he asked people around him, what is this person? And his servant said, oh, this is an old person. And the Buddha asked, how can people become old? And the servant explains the reason people become old. So the Buddha became very upset and returned to the palace. So what his father did was to indulge him with more women. He added 500 more women for him to entertain him. Okay. So here is another example showing the Buddha going out the palace from the east gate, and there's the old man standing next to him. The next time he went out from the west gate, and this time he encountered a funeral. So in the picture here, you can see the family bear a banner following the coffin going away to the burial site. And so, of course, the Buddha was shocked by what he saw. And so he asked people around him, who is this person? And his servant said, this is a dead person. And he asked, how can people die? And so people explained. And of course, the Buddha got upset and decided to go back to the palace. And again, his father added 500 more women for him to enjoy. His father probably really didn't understand him. So the next time Buddha went out, he went out from the south gate. He encountered a sick person, and the story goes the same. And so his father gave him another 500 women. Here is another example of the prince going out, and here's the sick person. So after returning to the palace, the Buddha was really unhappy. So here is a representation of the Buddha not being very happy in the palace, regardless of how many more women his father gave him. So at a certain point, SIDDHARTHA was really, really determined to leave the palace. But his father's concern was that he was going to become a king, and he was also a prince who should bear at least a son, so that the imperial line can continue. So the negotiation went on that SIDDHARTHA married YASHODHARA, and they together had a son named Rahula, who later became Buddha's disciple. And in this representation, you see the bride and groom join hands over a sacred fire. And then around this fire, they will circumambulate 3 times. This is an Indian tradition being depicted here. So after that, the Buddha went on to go out, and this time he went out from the north gate, and he encountered a monk, and he asked, "Who is this person?" And his servant say, "This is a monk." And he said, "What's a monk?" And then the servant replied that monk is a person who seeks the way, who leaves his home and his wife behind. He abandons all desires, and he upheld precepts, and so on and so on. Okay, so Siddhartha was inspired. He ordered the horse to turn around and went back to the palace. Of course, from that point on, he made up his mind he was going to leave the palace. But his wife was very suspicious of him and knew that he was going to leave. So his wife followed him inside and out everywhere, so that Siddhartha didn't have a chance to leave. So when he was 19, in some texts it says when he was 29, on the night of his birthday, heavenly beings appeared in the palace and told him that it was time to go. And Siddhartha told them that I have bodyguards and I can't go anywhere. So the heavenly beings made his wife and everybody slept. So here in this representation, you can see the musicians went to sleep, his wife went to sleep, and only him was awake. And before he departed, the text also mentioned that he went through a process of visualization of impurity, which means that he first looked at his wife, look at the body, beautiful body, and then start to imagine or contemplate or visualize the body becoming a corpse and decaying, and just goes from there to the smell and gross reality of the body, and that helped him to get rid of his desire and strengthen his resolve to leave the palace. So when they went out, he knew very well that if you attempt to open the door, people will hear. The guards will prevent anything from happening. So the heavenly beings then lifted the horse over the city wall, and that's how the Buddha departed. So after they walked for miles, the Buddha felt safe. So he disrobed his princely attire, and he exchanged with hunters in the mountains with their deer skin, and put that on as his clothes. This is a moment of denunciation, denouncing his princely existence. He also ordered his horse, his groom, Chandaka, to bring the horse Kantaka back to the palace. And of course, the Chandaka said that he can't do that because that will be disobeying the king's order. But in any case, in the pictorial representation, you can see the white horse kneeling down in front of the Buddha, and Buddha is about to depart to enter into the mountain. So here in this Yungang cave representation, you see the Buddha walking into the mountains. These sawtooth motifs here that you see on the lower part of the picture, these are the representations of mountains in early China. And in the mountains, there are a lot of people who are practicing meditation. So here is one of them. And Buddha Siddhartha was going to join them. So during the early days of his meditation, he would seek advice, instructions from these people who are already practicing in the mountains. So here is a representation of the Buddha asking instructions from more experienced practitioners. And he also followed the tradition of starving himself. It's an ascetic practice common at the time. And he would sit very still to the point that the birds can grow, can build their nest on his head. That just shows his determination, and he could sit for a long time. There was one point, according to the records, that he would only eat 1 grain of rice per day. And this image from the Broken Museum shows how emaciated Buddha had become in that practice. But also during that time, he was exhausted. His body became very, very weak. And he understood that this was not the way to reach what he wanted to reach. And so he abandoned this practice, and he received milk from a person. And that triggered people around him, 5 people who were sent by his father to protect him. They thought that he wimped out. He wasn't going to stick with the practice. So they left him in disappointment. We'll encounter those 5 people later. But here is a moment when Siddhartha left the mountain, came back to the lower land. This is a picture painted by a Chinese painter, Liang Kai, of the Southern Song Dynasty, titled Siddhartha Descending from the Mountain. Okay, coming down from the mountain. Still very emaciated, and coming down from the mountain. From that point on, he went to sit under a Bodhi tree for 7 days and nights to reach enlightenment. And on the screen is another depiction, a sculpture by a Taiwanese artist by the name of Huang Tushui. And this piece is in the Taipei Fine Arts Museum. So during Buddha's final meditation, which in record was 7 days and nights, Mara, the evil spirit, would send his daughter and all sorts of distractions to break the Buddha's concentration. If you practice meditation, you would know what that's like. But the Buddha was not affected. And at the moment that he reached enlightenment, he would make a hand gesture to indicate his enlightenment. We'll look at that in a moment. So in this representation, you see all kinds of distractions, beautiful woman, but the Buddha is very, very focused. And in this representation, which was made much earlier, the Buddha is not depicted. There's a throne with cushion, and there's all these distractions around him, and there's this Bodhi tree behind that indicates the Buddha was in his final meditation before he reached enlightenment. This is another example of the aniconic depiction of the Buddha. We know it's the Buddha. We know the moment is when Buddha was about to reach enlightenment. And this is called the temptation of Mara. The Buddha is sitting under a Bodhi tree. So all the elements here tell us the iconography of this scene. So when the Buddha reached enlightenment, he reached his right hand to touch the earth, to call upon the earth to witness the moment of his enlightenment. And this particular mudra is called Bhumishpasha mudra. And in this particular scene, you will see the Buddha reach enlightenment. You will also see the temptations still going on around here. So it's a kind of two scene together, which happens very often in Buddhist art. So Buddha reached enlightenment, and the five people who abandoned him saw him and felt that the Buddha was very different, and they were very curious, and so they came and listened to the Buddha's first sermon, and they became the Buddha's first 5 disciples. And so here in this representation, the Buddha is not represented, but you can see the wheel of Dharma is presented. So it indicates that this is the first sermon, and you have 5 disciples present at the deer park first sermon. And here is the content of his first sermon. First of all, in the picture, you can see the Buddha is symbolically turning the wheel of the law in this image. And you also have the 5 disciples sitting prominently around the Buddha. So the first sermon is the 12 Nidanas. And I listed the 12 of them here. So very interestingly, the first 2 exits, Buddha went out of the palace. He encountered first an old man and then a dead person. So from here, you can see the story dovetail very well with what he would teach later, is tracing this whole thing back to fundamental ignorance. And also from the 12 Nidanas, he derived the 4 Noble Truths. And this is also often taught in Buddhism. And the last of the 4 Noble Truths is the A4 path. And here are the A4 paths. And in this representation, you see the Buddha turning the wheel of the Buddha's law with representation of 2 deers. So this is the deer park. This is the first sermon. You have 5 of the first disciples. Then you have also Vajrapani, who is a guardian king. He holds a weapon in his hand. And this is a very good representation of the first sermon. There is another way the first sermon is represented, is showing the Buddha forming a teaching mudra that you see in the picture. And then on the bottom of the picture are the 5 disciples plus the So after Buddha's reached enlightenment, he began to miraculous events that happened in the time between his enlightenment and his nirvana, and these miraculous scenes are often documented in text and also in images. Here I select two. One is that he ascend and descend to and from heaven to preach to his mother, who was in her last incarnation as a heavenly being. Again, in this picture, you see the Buddha is not represented directly, except that a tree and a platform or dais is on top of the ladder. Excuse me. So the Buddha went up and came down on this ladder. In another representation, you see the Buddha's represented by a footprint which has a symbol of the wheel of the law. These are one of the 32 special marks, lakshanas, in Buddhist art. And here is the ladder going up and coming down. The Buddha is also represented separate form of a tree covered with very beautiful fabric. In this later representation, the Buddha is represented as a Buddha going up and coming down, but the story is the same. Okay. There's another story about the Buddha walking on the water or emerging from the water, and that story goes that 4 members of the Kashyapa community saw the Buddha in the water, at the bottom of the water. They feared that Buddha was going to drown, and so they got on a boat, tried to rescue the Buddha. But the Buddha then is represented here as a piece of rock, float to the top of the water, and then enter into the boat from the bottom of the boat without damaging it. Okay, so this is another representation. And on the side here, again, is another tree with a dais, and this tree is decorated with garland. That indicates that this is a representation of the Buddha. Okay. So Buddha taught from the moment he reached enlightenment all the way until his death, which is called parinirvana, when he was 80 years old. The story goes that when the Buddha passed away, his disciple Ananda was next to him, but his other disciple Kashyapa was away, and he couldn't get back early enough before they sealed the coffin, so he didn't get to see the Buddha at all. So he was really upset. So in this representation, you see the Buddha is wrapped in cloth. Ananda is here, and Mahakashyapa is rushing back to see him. And here is the Buddha in the coffin. Okay. And here is another representation of people trying to lift up the coffin, and they are a representation of 2 men well dressed with a jewel crown on their head. Some scholars interpret them as 2 Mala tribal men, but I sometimes wonder whether they are actually representations of of bodhisattvas. This will be an interesting twist in the Mahayana's view on the Buddha's death, which you will look at another example later here. So the Mahayanas, as we all know, have this belief that death is not a terrible thing. So death is just a transformation into a different life, and so the Buddha's death in this context is not a sad event. So therefore, the bodhisattvas are all very peaceful, whereas the disciples, they're the representations of the Theravada. They were very sad because they said that the Buddha passed away. So it's just a different perspective on the notion of nirvana. Okay. So the Buddha was cremated, and in Indian belief, the soul was transformed to the afterlife by Enki, who is the god of fire. So here in the representation, the fire has been put out by two people who were pouring water on the fire. So this is the end of the cremation. In all the Buddhist texts in Chinese, only one text that mentioned nirvana. This was actually translated from Sanskrit. Okay, so after Buddha's path, his remains were divided into multiple parts. There was one record that was divided into 84,000 parts. And here we can see a representation that the man Dona was dividing the remains of the Buddha, and then these relics were then being carried to different parts of the Buddhist kingdom and be worshipped, and so they became the foundation of stupa. So before I introduce the stupa, I like to say that in the East Asia tradition, I don't know whether this rose coffin and of the coffin. Okay. So with that, we come to the end of this short lecture. I'd like to introduce to you a few stupas, famous ones. Some still extant, some no longer extant, but can be found in representations in sculptures, such as this one. It's AMARAVATI stupa, which was built from 3rd century BCE to 250 CE, BC. Sorry, it should be CE. So this is built over time, over many centuries. Initially, these stupas are small mounds, and gradually they were built and built to become major monuments, and very elaborately decorated. A lot of the stories that we learn about Buddha's life today came from these stupas, or the railings around the stupa. This is another stupa in Bahut. The stupa itself is no longer extant, but the railing still extant in a museum in India, and some of the parts of the railing are scattered in museums around the world. And so here is a representation of the Bahut stupa. And if you go to India today, you can still visit the stupa in Sanchi. It's a structure with a railing, and pilgrims go in and circumambulate the stupa from left to right. And this is the current form of the Sanchi stupa. Okay, thank you. This is the end of the presentation today, showing the Buddha's life from conception to parinirvana.